Conventionally, it is argued that we live in a representative democracy. Members of the public have one vote each, and they elect professional politicians to represent their political views. Because politicians derive their power from popular election, those who get into power will be those who best meet the demands of the public, who will determine the major thrust of policy debates. The public will support politicians that represent their interests by making rational, informed choices. Over time, political parties will continue to flexibly adapt to best meet the needs of the public. The rich, the poor, and the politicians will all live happily ever after.
You serious?
David Cameron, George Osborne, Ed Miliband, Ed Balls, Theresa May, Alex Salmond, Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren. Let's face it, it's not just the Tories, it's not just the Republicans. They're all just working for the wealthy. Politicians do not care about the public. They're mainly just a few big interests looking out for themselves. Everybody knows that, right? Our political system is pretty much explicitly designed to fuck us over. But if we can figure out the specific ways we're being fucked over and exactly how it's happening, then we can think more about possible alternatives. And in this video, I'd like to outline the basic principles behind Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of party competition. The simple act of voting requires, at the very least, a minimal investment of time and attention. That's fairly uncontroversial. However, even at this point, some people will have greater means to do this than others. We can continue further up the scale. On a greater level, voting involves acquiring political information, analysing it, and acting upon it. Again, some people will have greater means to do this than others. On an even greater level, participation in the political process might involve organising a political party, setting up propaganda campaigns, and so on. Some people will definitely have greater means to do this than others. The overarching point here is that political action isn't free. It has a cost, and wealthy people will be better able to deal with that cost. This has a few exciting implications. Political action is investment. Capitalism is predicated on concentrations of wealth, and as long as capitalism exists, systemic economic inequality will continue to exist. We do not have an equal capacity to invest in politics. Voters hardly count unless they become major investors. How do we distinguish between major and minor investors? Well, it isn't so much a case of making a cut-off point at the top 10% income bracket or anything like that. Instead, it's simply a case of recognizing that a strong relationship exists between two different distributions, the distribution of economic power and the distribution of political power. When we're talking about the roots of economic inequality, we can certainly talk in more discontinuous terms of structural class distinctions, the capitalist class, the coordinator class, the working class, and so on. But here we're describing a continuum. The more economic power you have, the more political power you have, and the more political power you seek, the more economic power you will need. What we have, therefore, is a system in which groups of major investors come together to advance candidates representing their interests. On all of the issues that affect the vital interests that major investors all have in common, no party competition will take place. Major public policy proposals will reflect the interests of major investors, which minor investors are pretty much incapable of affecting, and as long as capitalist property norms don't emerge as the dominating issue, competition between groups of investors is what drives the system. The decisions of investors to back particular candidates will depend on their position in the economy, and which candidate will best represent their economic interests. Of course, supporting a candidate does not necessarily just mean funneling money to them in the form of public campaign contributions. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Support can mean financial support for front groups, foundations, think tanks, and media outlets that will best advance a candidate's interests, as well as formal endorsements of the candidate, which influence the decisions of the public because of the investor's position of power and authority in the society at large. Although the wealthy will be the most powerful, it is possible for working people to pool resources together and collectively become a substantial investor. If Labour dominates a political party, then wealthy capitalists from across various different industries will come together to organise a different political party against the Labour force. On the other hand, what if Labour isn't powerful enough to become the central focus of a political party? In this case, some capitalists may begin to support the Labour Party, and whether they do this depends on their position in the economy. The list of factors you could include here is potentially endless, but here we're just going to focus on the two most significant. First, class conflict. One basic feature of class conflict is the fact that as wages rise, profits will fall, and as profits rise, wages will fall. What does that entail within this context? Well, it's a given that Labour will be campaigning for higher wages, and this will squeeze profits. But this will affect some capitalists more than others. In particular, the more labour-intensive a business is, the more the owner will be affected by wage increases. And of course, by contrast, the more capital-intensive a business is, the less the owner will be affected by wage increases. Therefore, we can introduce the labour constraint rule. The more labour-intensive a business is, the less likely the business owner will be to extend support towards the Labour Party. This likelihood will also decrease as the power of Labour to determine public policy in its interest, and therefore class conflict, increases. As well as class conflict, another factor in determining a major investor's support for a political party is economic nationalism and internationalism. This really depends on the business's position in the global economy. Strong international competitors will look to support parties backing international free trade. On the other hand, weaker businesses that aren't able to compete with larger multinationals will tend to support parties that will back more economic nationalism, because they will implement policies that will protect them from foreign competitors. So with the labour constraint on the one hand and nationalism and internationalism on the other hand, we can devise a scatter graph. On one axis we have labour intensity, and on the other we have a scale of economic nationalism and internationalism. Our method of analysing a party system should be to identify the major investors in a given economy, look first at how labour-intensive or capital-intensive their businesses are, and secondly, how strong they are as international competitors. You can then plot out the industrial structure and see which quadrants the industries fall into: international labour-intensive, international capital-intensive, national labour-intensive, or national capital-intensive. The degree of political conflict in a party system depends on how concentrated or dispersed the major investors are within various different quadrants. If all of the industries are concentrated in the one quadrant, then you'll basically have a one-party state masquerading as a democracy. If they're concentrated in a couple of different quadrants, then you'll have some competition between two parties. But again, this is still masquerading as a democracy because what the public wants is largely irrelevant. Remember that as the power of labour increases, especially to the extent where the whole institution of capitalism comes into question, major investors will all clump together to stop the labour force. On the other hand, it is possible for political opportunists to take advantage of anti-capitalist sentiment among the labour force and use it to serve their own ends through vanguardism and authoritarianism. But of course, these methods do not offer any significant, lasting structural changes. They merely replace one set of rulers with another. With that quick jab at authoritarian revolutionaries aside, let's consider something else. How do we transition between different party systems? The first path is transition via prolonged economic boom. Sustained periods of growth and the resulting technological advancement lead to an increase in capital-intensive production techniques, as more labour is automated. This has happened over time since the Industrial Revolution. This trend towards greater capital intensity may lead to changes in labour policy that we looked at beforehand. Marxian arguments would also suggest that this leads to a gradually falling rate of profit over time, given that the ultimate source of profit, or surplus value, is exploitation of the workforce. As such, there may be an effort from business elites to raise the rate of exploitation of labour in an attempt to counteract the drive towards greater capital intensity. While there may be increasing capital intensity, another consequence of an economic boom is the development of new firms and sectors. If older elites aren't able to invest quickly enough in these sectors, new economic elites may emerge. The standard conflicts over labour and trade may continue, although the emergence of new elites may generate a degree of secondary conflict. Pressures in the financial system to adapt to new economic development may also generate secondary conflict over regulations. The second path between party systems is transition via economic depression. If a depression in one country coincides with a global economic collapse, businesses may be significantly affected by the strategies that their foreign competitors adopt, leading to an increase in economic nationalism. Another primary effect of an economic depression is the intensification of economic rivalries, leading to waves of bankruptcies and defensive mergers, causing businesses to disappear and suddenly relocate. This may lead to rapid changes in the party system if it occurs on a large enough scale. The importance of the money supply as a political issue dramatically increases. Firms become increasingly divided over whether to support deflation or reflation. Investors who wish to preserve the value of financial assets, big international banks, insurance companies and bondholders, will typically take the deflationary side, whereas others who wish to maintain any kind of purchasing power will take the reflationary side. Eventually, an emergency reflation coalition for national economic recovery will most likely emerge and come to power, and again similar secondary conflicts between old and new elites may emerge as well. All this time, the vast majority of the population do not exercise democratic control over any of the policies that will affect the vital interests of major investors, be it general or particular. That might seem like quite an extravagant claim. Surely politicians will respond to the popular will if it's big enough, right? Well, here's a thought experiment. Suppose you have a country with a very labour-intensive economy, based almost entirely on textile manufacturing. You have an election in which everyone votes for one of two political parties. There's only one issue, and everyone agrees on what it is: passage of legislation that is likely to lead to 100% unionisation of the workforce. All wage earners agree that the law is desirable. All textile magnates, 3% of the population, vehemently disagree. What position do the political parties take? Surely they would side with the majority of the population, right? Nope. Even in this circumstance, the political parties would side with the capitalists. Why? Because the political parties depend on funding from the textile industry. If they didn't get on the side of the major investors, then they wouldn't have the means to get elected. Here's another point. Doesn't the overall drive towards increasing capital intensity lead to a decline in conservatism? Why don't the parties supported by capital-intensive businesses simply win more and more over time, election after election? Well, there are ways for the labour-intensive parties to counteract that, in particular by means of hysteria, to divert the working class from its own economic interests. They have an overwhelming economic incentive to focus on social and cultural issues, such as the flag, patriotism, and what's called family values. They also have an incentive to identify minorities in society, whether ethnic, religious, or otherwise, and use them as scapegoats. To quote Noam Chomsky, jingoism, racism, fear, religious fundamentalism. These are the ways of appealing to people if you're trying to organise a mass base of support for policies that are really intended to crush them. Indeed, if the more conservative, labour-intensive parties do this enough, they can help to keep economic issues off the agenda altogether by focusing on cultural and social issues. Remember that as the power of labour increases, the capital-intensive parties will also go against the labour force. So, the investment theory of party competition can be summarised clearly as follows. 1. A strong relationship exists between the distribution of political power and the distribution of economic power. The more economic power you have, the more political power you have, and the more political power you seek, the more economic power you will need. Political actors are investors. 2. Political parties are blocks of major investors which coalesce to advance candidates representing their interests. On all of the major policy issues that affect the vital interests of all major investors, no party competition will occur. 3. Party systems will be determined by the position of major investors in the economy, most significantly by the labour intensity of their businesses and their strength as competitors in the global economy. 4. Transitions between party systems occur via prolonged economic booms or economic depressions, the former often leading to changes in labour policy, the latter leading to economic nationalism and conflicts over changes in the money supply, and both leading to conflicts between old and new elites. 5. As long as capitalism, the system characterised by private ownership of the means of production, exchange of goods for profit in a market economy, and wage labour continues to exist, competition between blocks of major investors drives the political system, with real democracy being fundamentally absent from the system. But there is another issue which also comes into play here regarding the influences that will affect the decisions of voters, which Thomas Ferguson identifies as follows. Just as large profit-maximising investors in parties do not pay to undermine themselves, major media, i.e. those big enough to have potentially significant effects on public opinion, controlled by large profit-maximising investors, do not encourage the dissemination of news and analyses that are likely to lead to popular indignation and, perhaps, government action hostile to the interests of all large investors, themselves included. And in part 2, we'll talk about another means by which the political system is in fact rigged. The systematic adjustment of public opinion in accordance with the needs of economic elites through the political economy of the mass media, a process which we might call manufacturing consent.